Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the Rogers Park Westridge Historical Society's annual meeting for 2023 on Zoom.
Good morning.
If you have any questions or comments during the meeting, please put them in the chat. We will answer them at the end of the program. So before I get started, I just want to say, could everybody put themselves on mute because it helps reduce with feedback. So before we get started, I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge our sponsors. Their generosity makes the Society's educational programs and events possible. Without their support, we would not be able to fulfill our mission of collecting, preserving, and telling the story of Chicago's far north side. So thank you, sponsors. I also want to mention our next live in-person event on Monday, April 24th at 6:30. Join us for an evening with former Alderman Patrick J. O'Connor. Mr. O'Connor served as alderman in the 40th Ward for over 35 years. He will be speaking at the Budlong Woods branch of the Chicago Public Library, located at 5630 North Lincoln Avenue. And more details will come on that. So to start the meeting, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Ken Walczak, our board president. He's going to provide updates on the Society's comings and goings in 2022 and also lead the election of the Historical Society's board members. So Ken, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to the annual meeting of the Rogers Park Westridge Historical Society. As Sarah said, I'm Ken Walczak, and I've been presiding over these meetings for what seems like forever. And as my father used to say, I still get a kick out of it. As most of you know by now, I try to keep my remarks as brief as possible. We'll have a short report on 2022, along with an update on where we're headed. We will follow that up with our most hotly contested board elections of the modern era. And then we'll have Professor LaDale Winning's talk about the Chicago Convenants Project. As all good mission statements are supposed to be, ours is one short sentence. We probably should have the word diverse in all caps because it really defines us. Telling that story of what is really the most diverse community in the city, if not the nation, is what we try to do. And the next slide. As far as our accomplishments in 2022 go, I've learned over the years to try and have the revenue outpace the expense. This is one of the first, if not the first year where we took in more than we spent. If you look at the rest of the bar charts, you'll see that almost all have grown during 2022. Truly a good sign. We hope that continues in 2023. Membership, sponsorships, events, and social media traffic are all way up, which is terrific and sort of a testament to the folks who really make that happen on our board and our staff and our volunteers. As part of what we do here, Donna Vitale has been spearheading a project that we all will hopefully live to see come to fruition. The renaming of the current Passion Park in order to honor the Pollard family, first Black family in Rogers Park, and an incredibly influential and accomplished family in the city and the country for that matter. Sports fans, most sports fans know the name Pollard, and he was only one of a remarkable family. Seems like one of these no-brainers, yet we have been struggling with the Chicago Park District to get the name change taken care of on this park. As you can see, there are other initiatives underway And if, as members of our community, you have ideas for projects, please let us know so we can consider taking them on. I won't say much about these next two slides other than to continue to hammer home the importance of business sponsorships. We increased these sponsorships in 2022, but we still have a long way to go. And it sort of ties into memberships in general. We really want more and more people to become members of the society, really at whatever level people are able to join, both business and personal memberships and family memberships and so on. Realtors are a crucial part of our membership base, our sponsorship base. We love having them. There's a lot of them active in both our neighborhoods, in Rogers Park and Westridge. And it would be wonderful to have many, many more of them join up and become sponsors. So if you're buying or selling a house in the neighborhood in the near future, please mention to your realtor that they should be joining and sponsoring the historical society. It's a good way to get them involved and to have them realize how important their membership is. Property History Quest has become a project that's been so popular. It's been literally overwhelming. Donna Vitale and her incredible team have completed dozens of stories of Rogers Park and Westridge homes, with dozens more in the queue. I know she's looking for more help, desperately looking for to research and tell these stories. So if you're interested, please contact us and we'll put you in touch with Donna, and hopefully we can cut down on the length of the queue here so that we can be cranking these out in a more efficient way. And thank you, Donna. Really, you do a great thing. This is it's a terrific program and project. Our photo collection. I have to give a huge shout out here to Rob Case, our volunteer extraordinaire. Really, whatever needs doing, Rob seems to do, and has been doing for 20 years. He's been slogging away at organizing our photo archives, another seemingly endless project. And he also leads occasional photo scrums. And if this kind of work, identifying and cataloging a very cool collection of photos, appeals to you, please contact us. We can put you in touch with Rob, and I'm sure he'll be happy to put you to work. Rob, thank you again for everything that you do.
You're welcome.
All right. We finally get to Glenn Aves, who also has been involved with the society for more years than I, certainly. I'm not sure quite how long, but many years. She has been involved with, as you see there, the transfer of our papers and archives to the Northside Neighborhood History Collection, which is housed at the Sulzer Library. You see a picture of the library at the bottom there, the first slide. And she's still going at it, though I think that now that the end is in sight, Glenna, she can maybe get back to cleaning out her own basement, which has been a project on hold, as I understand it, for quite some time. Again, Glenna, thank you very much for everything that you do. And on the next slide, we see another new volunteer, Lucy Burns. And again, she's been assembling, identifying, organizing, just working her you-know-what off to to get this project complete, the archives. And Lucy, once you're done with this, we can definitely use you at the hardware store. So we, again, thank you very much for all that you're doing. And that sort of brings us to volunteer opportunities. There are tons and tons of them, and I know we have plenty of people with plenty of expertise in this neighborhood, and it would be wonderful to get more of you involved. And if you've got, even if you don't think your skills are particularly unique, please get in touch with us, and we'll try and put you to work. We just are. We really are looking for good, solid people at this point, and please, your skills are in demand. So again, contact us. You can see at the bottom, rpwrhs.org, Rogers Park Westridge Historical Society.org, and we can get you involved. We'd love to. I really wish to thank all of our current and departing board members. If you see them around the hood, thank them for their service. They're absolutely terrific. Along with our one-man band of an office staff, Stephanie Bardo, we all wear many hats in this organization. And again, we're, as I said earlier, we're always looking for more folks to give us a hand. The board is just our board is great. It's just great. And I also want to thank a couple of people who are leaving our board at this point. The first being Kay McSpadden. I've seen Kay on Zoom today, and I really want to offer her my heartfelt thanks, and that of all of us, for all that you've done over the years. You're not going to just walk away. We're not going to allow that. We want to continue to be the beneficiaries of your wisdom and kindness. So Kay will be serving. We had to make up a title, I guess. Ex officio sounds very fancy. And again, Kay, we hope you stay involved. The other board member who's leaving is Andrea Kern. Andrea, thank you very much. I haven't seen your name on the list of participants. I hope you're here. You really have helped in many ways, primarily growing our social media footprint, without which I'm not sure we'd be around these days post-COVID. It's been crucial to have a social media presence, and you've done a great deal to help that. And I hope you'll continue to help out in whatever ways you can going forward. Thank you again. Before the election of our new board, I just want to say how excited I am to be welcoming our 3 new board members and our 1 current board member who we're going to elect again onto the board. Belinda, Nicole, and Peter bring to the society the deepest and most diverse backgrounds in my time on the board. They've got great resumes, and we're really hoping to take advantage in a good way of all of them. I'm, as I say, really excited about their joining us, and I want to welcome all 3 of you to what I hope will be a great experience. And we all thank you for your willingness to join in with us, move the Historical Society forward. So at this time, I want to propose that I hope I'm doing this the right way. I think I would know after all this time. But I want to propose that we re-elect the following board members for another term. Myself, Ken Walchik, Dave Kolensky, um, George Tobin, Jim, Sarah, and Donna Vitale. The only one who are actually re-electing is Dave. The rest of us are remaining on board. In addition, I want to propose that we elect our three new nominees for the board: Belinda Gunn, Nicole Coleridge, and Peter Medlock. All in favor somehow say aye.
Aye, aye.
Aye, aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right.
Aye.
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 Good.
Nose.
Aye.
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 All right. And any of those who are opposed, we're really not interested in hearing from you. I hope that it was a unanimous election, and I want to again welcome all four of you, one back to the board, and all three of you onto the board. We got you now. And now, before I turn things over to Sarah, actually, to introduce our speaker, just a quick wrap up from me. Again, I want to thank all of the folks who've been participating in a real true grassroots organization. We need your energy. We need your friends' energy. We need your family's energy. And of course, we need your financial support at whatever level you're able to provide. But mostly, we need your participation and your time and whatever you can provide to us. Thank you again to everyone. Go to rpwrhs.org. And Sarah, take it away.
Thank you, Ken. Okay, so I want to remind everybody to, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat, and I'm sure you're going to have some questions for today's special guest, Dr. LaDale Winling. Dr. Winling is an associate professor of history at Virginia Tech. His work has been supported by grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Newberry Library, among many other institutions. He is the author of Building the Ivory Tower, a book that examines the role of American universities as real estate developers in the 20th century. His works, Mapping Inequality, Redlining in New Deal America, and Electing the House of Representatives, 1840 to 2018, are included in the American Panorama Digital History Atlas at the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab. His most recent digital work is called the Chicago Convenants Project. The project focuses on the racially restrictive covenants and deed restrictions used to promote segregation in the first half of the 20th century. LaDale leads a team of researchers and dedicated volunteers who will ultimately show the property location of every racially restrictive covenant in Cook County. He is here today to talk about this project and to explain the surprising ways these covenants from the past continue to impact the people who live in Chicago now. Welcome, LaDale.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Is my sound okay?
You sound fine, but I want to make sure everybody else is on mute, including me. I'm muting myself right now.
Great. Let me first share my screen. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me. And I want to say I'm a public historian and urban historian at Virginia Tech. I actually taught for 2 years at Loyola Chicago, and Rogers Park is a place that is near and dear to my heart. And it was while I was a graduate student that I did research on real estate, urban renewal, and urban development at mid-century in Chicago, and it's a place that I come back to every year. And that's in fact the kind of research trajectory that in part led me to the research on racially restrictive covenants. And I'll say, right, like we may know, you may be familiar with racially restrictive covenants, but these are documents that are embedded in our fundamental real estate transfers and real estate documents that are stored at the clerk's office for Cook County. And you see an example on screen here, which illustrates, right, like how clear the intent and how kind of like bold the effort was to exclude in a number of neighborhoods all across Chicago, all across Cook County, all across Metro Chicagoland in the first half of the 20th century. And so these two clauses that you see kind of highlighted and the clause underlined in red here reads, "No part of said premises shall be sold, given, conveyed, or leased to any Negro or Negroes, except if they work as house servants, janitors, or chauffeurs, or so forth." And so these kinds of documents, I think now seem hidden, forgotten, and are difficult to find, but that they structured and were so central, and in fact mainstream within our real estate sector and real estate activities for the first half of the 20th century, has pretty profound implications for racial segregation, racial inequality, as well as a variety of other kind of like neighborhood factors, conditions, and even how we think of what a good or successful neighborhood is today, or what we think of as a challenged or failing neighborhood today, right? So as a historian, I was interested when I first came across these. I was doing some other research at the Cook County clerk's office, or then the recorder of deeds, and I wondered, like, what are the origins of these? What do we know beyond the kind of basic history that scholars have had illustrated? And like really fundamental to understanding racial covenants in Chicago is to understand that Chicago is the national capital for real estate in the United States. And it has been for all of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. These two individuals that I show you on the screen here, on the left is Nathan McChesney, who was a attorney in Chicago. He had been a trustee for Northwestern University, and he had been the general counsel for the National Association of Real Estate Boards. He was also a good friend and ally of Herbert Hoover, who's a prominent Chicago Republican in the kind of first third of the 20th century. The man on the right, Richard Ely, was a professor at Northwestern University. He created a real estate research institute. He in fact founded the American Economics Association back in the 1880s, basically one of the most prominent economists in the country. He was a graduate advisor to Woodrow Wilson when he taught at, when Ely taught at Johns Hopkins in the 1870s and 1880s. And these two were kind of part of a broad coalition of academics and policymakers and professionals with an interest in real estate who helped kind of structure and like create the underlying theories and then use those to inform professional practices that we see continue throughout the 20th century. So understanding Chicago Covenants, it's necessary to understand that Chicago was the center of the real estate industry. Chicago was renowned as the kind of like one of the centers of redlining, right? And those collaborators, Ely, and McChesney, as well as a number of other professionals, helped create the system that we now know of as redlining. And in fact, it was in some ways like created to address the demographic and social and political challenges that were arising in Chicago and a number of other cities in the course of the Great Migration. And basically, racial covenants, redlining, and discriminatory appraisal were ways of facilitating racial segregation that would be bureaucratic and bloodless and would be less violent than Chicago had seen in events like the 1919 race riot, right? That was a kind of week-long series of violent events that were eventually quelled by the Illinois National Guard coming out. And it was a huge embarrassment and political crisis for the city and for the state. And so civic leaders came together and said, like, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? And real estate leaders came forward and said, well, we think that if we can segregate more effectively, we can eliminate the kind of racial tension that comes from competition over jobs and competition over housing. And so they proceeded with implementing racially restrictive covenants, land use zoning, which kind of went alongside the use of covenants, and then redlining. So we see two of these kinds of covenants that were created and very much popularized in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. And we've got an example here. One is created by real estate developers when they create a new plat and file it with the county. So you can see one example here, and I'll zoom in on the restrictions. It says, this may not be conveyed or leased to anyone who is not a Caucasian. And that's the kind of covenant that may be that's created before any lots are sold. Like one person is responsible for creating this restriction, and then it runs with the land, or it did run with the land for every subsequent transaction, right? But there's another, the type that I showed you at the very outset here, which has these clauses, and these are in central city neighborhoods in places like Hyde Park, in places like Inglewood, in places like Beverly, that are already built up, whether they be with single family residences or whether they be apartment buildings. But the property owners in places that are already developed come together and they agree, they sign to pledge that they will never lease or allow inhabitants by or sell to African Americans, right? And so those come with, there's a lot of people involved in creating these kinds of covenants because neighbors, in some cases, 75% of property owners, 85% of property owners, or 95% of property owners have to agree to these kinds of covenants. And so it was estimated by civil rights researchers with the NAACP at mid-century that potentially 80% of residential properties in Chicago in the 1940s were covered by racial covenants. And that's a very rough estimate. And I would say, you know, like I got interested in this and helped create this research effort to kind of test that, to find out whether that was the case. And at this point, it's a little too soon to tell. 80% feels a little bit high for the entirety of the city of Chicago or for Cook County, but it does seem very plausible that like 50%, 60%, something along these lines. And we're in the process of researching plat by plat, neighborhood by neighborhood, parcel by parcel, the existence of these racial covenants. And so how are these like established, right? I mentioned that the individual real estate developers, right, when they're platting something out, it's easy to create a document and basically say, before anyone has any say, we will establish that if you buy, you're more or less buying into the idea that this will be a segregated neighborhood. However, in the central city covenants, you got to convince a wide array of neighbors. And so what we see is the rise of these restriction associations and property owners associations, like this one in Auburn Park, where it's an effort to draw on the civic bonds of and the kind of neighborhood relationships within communities, where they basically say, we are working to keep this neighborhood white, and we're working to keep out the risks, the property risks, the social risks, and the potential conflict of that can come if this becomes a multiracial neighborhood. And so they basically they cajole their neighbors, and they go house to house, they go door to door, they go block to block, and they have mailings like this where it says, we enclose this anti-colored restriction agreement, and 80% of the neighbors are in favor of this, and we're on the cusp of passing and filing this. So would you please, kind of put us over the top and complete this process and ensure the continuing whiteness of our neighborhoods? And this particularly points out that this agreement was drafted by the attorneys for the Chicago Real Estate Board. And Nathan McChesney, the individual I pointed out at the beginning, was a consultant for the Chicago Real Estate Board. Real estate efforts or research efforts, pardon me, by sociologists in the 40s kind of like documented that these are well established all around the area that had been known as the Black Belt, right? So Kenwood, Hyde Park, Woodlawn, South Shore, Englewood, Park Manor, Chatham, and so forth. Additionally, along the emerging West Side set of African-American neighborhoods. But the efforts had not been made to locate these in like more traditional white areas that were far from the Black Belt, far from the West Side. And so what our effort is, there's basically to fill in the gaps of the research from NAACP activists in the 1940s to establish like how widespread were these. And we know the broad outlines of the individual, broad outlines of the use of covenants, but we don't know how this plays out neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood. In fact, there's a famous case, which I'm sure you have heard of Hansberry versus Lee. This is the Carl Hansberry, the father of Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, challenged a covenant in the Woodlawn, like Washington Park Woodlawn area. And a lawyer with that effort basically went to the Cook County Recorder of Deeds office, and over the course of a year looked up every deed, looked up every covenant, compared signatures. And what he illustrated was that there had been an effort which was actually fraudulent to create the covenant in the Woodlawn neighborhood. Basically, the people who organized it lied to their neighbors, and they asked them to sign the form without having them read the restrictive covenants in many cases. And then they actually didn't reach the threshold of 95% of property owners. It was something like 54, 55% of property owners, but they were so committed to racial segregation that they filed it anyways. And then they said, we know this is fake and it would not stand up in court if it were contested. So they created a test case, and they said, okay, everybody, judge, opposing attorney, do you stipulate, do you agree to, without even investigating, that this is operative and it has been signed by 95% of property owners? And that was stipulated to, and then the case was decided on. And so it meant that it was very, very difficult to challenge the veracity of the racially restrictive covenant afterwards. And so it stood up for about 13, 14 years until the effort by Hansberry and Harry Pace, who is a insurance company executive. But that one covenant, which is the most renowned, it was decided ultimately by the US Supreme Court, is just one of hundreds, one of thousands of covenants that existed in Chicago and in Cook County. So this effort, how will we find all of them? This is the Cook County Clerk's office in the tracts department. There's about 2,500 tract books, which detail about 50 million transactions. And against all odds and against all reason, we're going book by book, page by page, line by line to find these restrictive covenants. And that may sound a little bit crazy, but it's doable with a good deal of volunteer effort and some very, very competent research assistants who are, mostly undergrads and graduate students at universities across Chicago. How do we find them? Like, one of these pages looks like this, and it lists the grantor grantee, the document number, and when it was. So you can see I've got lightly outlined in yellow about 2/3 of the way down a document that says it is a race restriction. And so they had the good the work to document this was so clear and it was so mainstream that they in fact noted that it was a racist covenant in 1934. It was hardly controversial. It had already been decided in favor of by the US Supreme Court in a 1926 case. And so this was just as much a matter of bureaucratic process as paying your taxes, paying your real estate taxes, or, going down to like file for voter registration, right? But because there's this notation, we can identify every single one of these as we work through. So we have volunteers who join us about every 2 weeks, and we've been through about 25% of the city of Chicago, and we found about 1,000 covenants. And we've now launched a map, which is available at Chicago Convenants. And we've gone through just about all of Englewood. We've gone through all of Kenwood and Hyde Park and Woodlawn, all of Beverly, and a couple other neighborhoods. We're basically proceeding neighborhood by neighborhood. And you can find some of the information about the covenants. About these, you can see in an animated fashion how they proceed, how they're created, as well as how they expire. And in many cases, we have these digitized where you can see the actual covenant in like PDF form. Right? And so we're building a database of these covenants. What I would say is to this question of how do covenants that were established in the 1920s or the 1930s or the 1940s, how do they affect us still today? And one of the key ways that they do affect us is that the transition of real estate neighborhood by neighborhood is slow. And so, for example, I noted that these realtors and these researchers in the 1920s, they work with the Hoover administration and the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s to help reform the real estate sector and the home finance sector. And one of the things that emerged from that was the creation of the long-term mortgage. Mortgages used to be 3 years, 5 years, maybe 7 years. And the federal government, in the course of the Depression, created the 15-year long-term mortgage. And that was extended to 25 years. And now we think of 30 years as kind of conventional. And that was a result of the work of the federal government informed by these real estate leaders. And so when you buy a house, get a mortgage, you're making a commitment for 30 years. And right, we know, of course, not everybody stays in a house for 30 years. They may stay for 5 years or 10 years. They may stay shorter. but they also may stay longer. My grandfather, who was a World War II veteran, after he came back from the war, he bought a house in 1948, and he lived in it for the next 65 years of his life until he died in 2014. From 1948 to 2014, one investment, one real estate decision shaped an individual parcel, but was part of a broader kind of like working class post-World War II neighborhood where the kind of demographics and the culture were shaped by these decisions in the 1940s, but endured throughout the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st century. These covenants were meant, like one of the fundamental ideas of the real estate leaders was that stability was good for investment, stability was good for neighborhoods, and stability was good for like home ownership. And so these efforts were meant to prevent change, to prevent demographic change, to prevent the change of like the class of the owner profiles, and to keep them as similar as possible from the 1920s, from the 1930s, from the 1940s, while the city of Chicago was facing a set of really dramatic economic, social, political, and of course, demographic changes. And so it's not too hard to see, I'm sure, when you think about the people who live in your neighborhood, like you've got some old timers, you've got some enduring residents who I'm sure maybe they have lived there for 50 years. Maybe they have the same house that their parents grew up in. And we can see the endurance of a wide array of these choices and decisions. And that goes on an individual basis. But then I'm sure you know that there's the culture and those kind of community relationships that are built in a web of interactions over time also endure and are even slower to change. And so when they're shaped in the 30s and the 1940s, and then a bit in the 1950s, those can endure even more after the specific real estate decisions or the specific real estate owners have changed, right? Because, for example, when we shop for a house or when we look for a community, we look for something that endures, or we try to move to a place that's kind of consistent with our values and so forth. And then I would say, finally, racially restrictive covenants were ruled unenforceable in 1948 by the Supreme Court, and they were outlawed by the federal government in 1968. But many of the underlying structures and many of the underlying mechanisms remained even after the racial language was removed, right? So after 1950, we see hardly any plant restrictions that mention race. There are a handful, but they're much rarer. However, there's a wide variety of similar or allied restrictions that last, which were always there. Minimum lot size, minimum home value, and eliminating a variety of like activities, live work spaces, or something along these lines, that meant that it kind of prolonged and kind of kept the exclusionary nature of many of these covenants even after the racial language was eliminated. And so, right, I'm sure you see kind of some of the implications of that, even as we're living and working and thinking about this in 2023, how the legacy of these actions 80, 90, and 100 years ago can kind of potentially still affect us today. So I'll end there, and I would be happy to take any questions. And you've seen the URL where we list where potential volunteer sessions are held in our trainings training schedule is listed on the web because we rely upon the efforts of civically engaged individuals to kind of help us document this, because I fundamentally believe as a historian, we have to kind of establish a set of facts and establish an evidentiary basis that will enable us to have, I think, a civic reckoning with this kind of legacy of racial inequality across the 20th century.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your point about how it affects things today, about how slowly real estate gets moved around. And, you know, one of the things I read about on the news is there's not enough housing being built, or there's not really enough housing. So you can see that makes it even slower. It makes the change slower. Do you think that your findings will have an effect on, say, something like reparations or new city investment in areas where this very unfair practice happened?
I'll say there is the significant potential for that, and I hope I don't make specific recommendations about public policy because those are political questions, but I think we can kind of broadly acknowledge that there is this legacy of inequality and exclusion. And I will say that, for example, the Evanston reparations program drew upon one of my other projects, Mapping Inequality. I showed you the redlining map, which we digitized all of the redlining maps across the United States. And the people who kind of drove that process made specific reference to mapping inequality in our redlining maps as illustrating this kind of legacy of government-led discriminatory housing practice. So I think that there are opportunities for using this kind of knowledge base and using this research base to inform questions about reparative public policy. Now, I would say that there's a wide array and forms of that kind of equitable and reparative public policy. One of the things that the city of Chicago has been undertaking, and that has been a movement much more broadly, is the creation of more open space and urban tree cover, which environmental scientists and environmental economists have illustrated is kind of related to this legacy of redlining. Basically, a neighborhood that would be given a green coloring or an A rating and labeled as best. One of the factors would be how much park land there was, how much open space there was, how much tree cover there was. And so those conditions for the 20s and 30s would be kind of reinforced. And then it would be, the neighborhood would be open to more investment, maintenance, and expansion of parks, tree covers, and so forth, where redlined neighborhoods would be often covered over with impervious surface, asphalt parking lots that would absorb heat and would create urban heat islands. And so there's been a movement among kind of environmental justice advocates to green redlined neighborhoods with more parks, with more trees, and with more open space rather than kind of impervious surfaces. And that has kind of indirect implications for like the racially discriminatory nature of redlining historically, but it's kind of like a geographical or spatial justice effort. I think we can kind of agree urban heat islands are bad. Whoever lives there, we should want open space, tree cover, and like supportable or tolerable like summer temperatures at the hottest parts of the year and the hottest parts of the day.
So we have a couple of questions that sort of have the same theme. You know,
Mhm.
you've mentioned the black belt.
Mhm.
What about looking for covenants that exclude Jews or like Latinos, like or Chinese, like was that a thing in Chicago as well?
In Chicago, we find 2 points, and if anyone is named for exclusion, more than 99% of the time, it says may not be sold to Negro or Negroes in the racial covenants. And those are the ones in the central neighborhoods, the already developed neighborhoods. We see in the developer created plat restrictions, which are in outlying areas, that it says may not be sold to anyone who's not a member of the Caucasian race or who's not a member of the white race. And that's much more broadly discriminatory. And those may exclude Jews, as well as this broader early 20th century notion of a wide variety of races. Asians would have been considered a different race in that era. But in Chicago, we do not see very many examples that did not specifically refer to African Americans in the covenants. However, I've talked with a couple of people in your group who illustrate that in real estate ads, there are restrictions or promotional materials which say will be sold to Gentiles only, for example. And one of the things that we want to emphasize is like covenants are not the whole story. Redlining is not the whole story, because there's also private practice. And when someone says, we are definitely not going to sell, like the government doesn't need to be involved at all, a private person will not sell to a Jew in this neighborhood, covenants can't explain that, but they're part of a network because realtors were so intimately involved at every step of the process, as well as real estate financiers. So for your specific question, we basically only see that terminology of may not be occupied by Negro or Negroes, or may not be occupied by someone who's not a member of the Caucasian race. But there's a wider array of those forms of exclusion in private practice that kind of work together. And I'll also say I'm in touch with covenants researchers in places around the country. And one of the issues is like each city or each region has a set of kind of fears based upon who the newcomers are. And so we see in the Southwest, people of Mexican heritage are called out for exclusion, whereas on the West Coast, people of Asian ancestry are called out for exclusion. And where I live in Virginia, we see Italians, Greeks, as well as Syrians called out, because there were particular kind of pathways and streams of new immigrants coming to Virginia that kind of excited the exclusionary fears of realtors, real estate developers, and neighborhoods in these Virginia communities.
Okay, so this question it's related to what you're talking about, and I would love to get your opinion on it. Somebody made the comment of before the 20th century, the first racially restrictive was the treaty which evicted Native Americans from the slanted strip land in Chicago, the north boundary, which is here in the Indian boundary in Rogers Park.
So one of the ways that historians have been kind of working to make sense of this is that, a covenant created in, say, 1927 builds upon a much longer tradition of exclusion and removal. And like a number of historians kind of emphasize this tradition of what's called settler colonialism, which is, kind of ties this exclusionary effort against African Americans or against European immigrants in the 1920s, 1930s, to the 19th century effort to remove Native Americans, to force treaty cession of lands, and then to kind of move natives to reservations. And so, and I'll say that I think is like very plausible. And there's a recent book called The Broken Heart of America by a historian named Walter Johnson about St. Louis, which kind of ties those 19th century forms of removal to 20th century forms of exclusion. And it's very much worth thinking about, particularly when we think like, how can we stop, or how can we reverse, or how can we remediate this 100-year-old process, this like 200-year-old process, or something along these lines. But first, I think acknowledging that, you know, it took 100 years to get where we are now. It's going to take a concerted effort long term to kind of create the more equitable and, I think, open kind of community that I think we desire, but it's not going to happen overnight. And so there is that kind of very, very long tradition. Then I will also say, on the topic of kind of like racial covenants, the first historians have typically said that these kind of originate in places like San Francisco against Asian immigrants. And the kind of earliest Supreme Court cases bear this out. So it depends how you think about this, whether you say like the origins were the 1870s, or whether you say the origins were like the 17th century, the 18th century, or early in the 19th century. There are compelling and useful cases in you know, for either interpretation for the enduring nature of this.
We're really getting close to time, but we have 2 more questions. Would you be willing to answer them? Okay. The first one is interesting. It's probably pretty quick. It says, could restrictive covenants and redlining have been the North's form of Jim Crow laws?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There's an effort to document racial covenants in Minneapolis and St. Paul, which they call the Jim Crow of the North. And in fact, you know, I mentioned that Chicagoans were kind of central to this. And there is what's known as the Chicago School of Sociology, a group of sociologists who are very prominent at the University of Chicago. And one of them, kind of the father of urban sociology, was named Robert Park. He helped train, you know, like an entire generation of sociologists. And he'd worked in the South. He had been basically like a PR person for Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee Institute. And he saw, as Booker T. Washington is kind of renowned, he saw potential in the kind of separation of the races, like not demanding the full immediate participation of African Americans in all forms of political, economic activity, and so forth. And I have a collaborator who's a professor at Trinity College in Hartford, who makes the case that his urban sociology, which basically said that there were kind of natural places in a city for working people to live, for professional class people to live, for African Americans to live in an ecosystem, just as we would see in the natural world, like species finding kind of little niches in their habitats and ecosystem. And with that set of ideas, he trained a wide variety of sociologists and future policymakers, and was like highly involved in all kinds of civic efforts in Chicago. And that's one example of the way that racial segregation, which we have often thought, like it's been long reviled, the Jim Crow South, but people have kind of forgiven what's often called the de facto segregation or the kind of customary segregation in cities in the North, when in fact we can see that local governments, state governments, and the federal government was actually complicit in enacting racial segregation using different mechanisms in the North.
Well, and somebody wants to know, is gentrification kind of like another mechanism for like covenants or redlining?
So I'll say, I don't think that there's a one-to-one relationship, but where I definitely see or where we hear a good deal of housing activists make the connection is on the issue of like housing justice, which is to say that home finance and in many cases like urban planning and real estate practice emphasizes, largely emphasizes investment in, investment in already established areas or adjacent to already established and desirable areas, and in some cases promote economically exclusionary or economically exploitative investments in areas which had been open to working class families, working class communities, and racial minorities and immigrant groups. And so when we think about kind of principles of housing justice or housing equity, we can see that there are still significant inequalities in real estate practice and in urban planning practice. But it can be a little more difficult, and I would not say that there's a one-to-one, or we should say one form of exclusion has simply become the other form of exclusion. But these can be like very difficult or complicated to tease out, even though some of the same races, some of the same immigrant groups can end up losing in like both of these systems.
Somebody wanted to know, have you looked at the issue of contract sales where many Black homeowners often lost all the equity they had in their homes? Any information on how racial covenants and contract sales?
So I have not done specific research on contract sales, but I'm part of a kind of community of researchers who do. And so contract sales become most prominent when African Americans are kept out of the kind of mainstream housing programs. Basically, if you can't get a mortgage because FHA won't insure your mortgage, even if you're a veteran, or even if you're like, or VA won't insure it in the 1950s, then you may have to go to contract sales, which are often exploitative because you can't get the regular source of financing. If you are held out of ownership of 80% of Chicago by some of those estimates, then if you want the stability of home ownership, you may take any opportunity that is offered to you. And so contract sales are kind of a subsequent or a consequence of these forms of exclusion earlier, kind of upstream. I also have a colleague named Andrew Carl who does research on tax auctions and tax forfeiture. Right? Basically, if you don't pay your taxes, your house can be seized, and then the tax debt is sold. And then someone could, like, as a result, more or less like buy your house because it's for the cost of the tax debt because you forfeit it, and then rent it back to you, or force you, if you want to stay in it, to take a land contract. And so there's a wide variety of kind of subsequent exploitative practices that come about as a result of this initial exclusion from the housing market.
Okay, and I really do have one last question.
I'll say I just saw in the chat, Family Properties by Beryl Satter.
Yes.
She's one of the leading
Oh.
historians of contract sales and talks about that in Chicago.
Somebody asked though about the Fair Plan insurance program that enabled redlining. Has your team investigated that impact?
We have not. There have been a wide variety of kind of compensatory or subsequent efforts to combat redlining. And, in many cases, whatever the effort, it still serves, basically getting African Americans, for example, or getting immigrants into their houses is only a modest, that's only a secondary or tertiary goal. In many cases, any of these kind of federal housing programs are really simply about supporting the real estate industry or supporting the home finance industry. And so they only have very modest impacts for equity. My sense is that this has changed very, very recently. So one of those programs, the Community Reinvestment Act, was an effort from 1977 to kind of help preclude kind of financial redlining or to kind of channel investment into urban communities. And while it has had, a solid track record, its goals were only very modest. And it's only very recently that there's efforts to lobby the federal government to incorporate demographic characteristics in evaluation of a neighborhood for a kind of revamped Community Reinvestment Act. And the Department of Justice under the Biden administration now is pursuing present day, private redlining somewhat more aggressively than basically any administration up to this point has done. But it's only been kind of very modest because the financial sector and the real estate industry are very kind of very politically powerful efforts, and I think are also still concerned with stability and with not pursuing radical transformations of public policy or radical transformations of American communities.
Well, I just know everybody on this group really appreciates your time to speak to us, and we're all going to be really interested to see what you and your volunteers find about the far north side of Chicago. I want to remind everybody that you can learn more about this at chicagocovenants.com. And, just thank our guest. Really appreciate it. You really made the annual meeting pop.
Well, thank you so much for your patience with my audio, and also, I want to emphasize these kind of national policy efforts or these citywide efforts to create and implement and defend covenants can seem like they're extremely difficult and glacial to change. But I fundamentally believe in the value of individual volunteerism, and particularly building kind of civic coalitions, person by person, neighborhood by neighborhood, community group by community group, to build grassroots support for reckoning with and remediating this legacy of exclusion and discrimination, and also celebrating the kind of resistance that civil rights activists, white and Black, pursued to oppose racially restrictive covenants. And so, groups like this are essential to that reckoning, and I think to building and supporting civic initiatives to make a better Chicago.
That's right. It's been a fight. It's been like a war. So, Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great Saturday. We'll see you next time.